Please welcome Kim Wehle, who will present the historical context and contemporary challenges surrounding the presidential pardon. Kim, take it away.
Thank you so much, Deborah, for that very kind introduction. I'm very proud to be part of the Chevy Chase community. Not only do we share BCC and we share the gym, Pilates, but I have four daughters to your four sons, so we could have an entire homecoming party. Anyway, so the fourth book, Pardon Power, the first one was on the Constitution. I started getting involved in writing for more general audiences, non-legal audiences, not scholarly readers when Trump first took office. And I was sitting and reading the Sunday Times, which I always do, the actual paper version. And there was an article that said the pardon power is absolute and there are no limits on it. And I said, well, that can't be right. There's no absolute powers in the Constitution. Everything is checked by other powers. If the president were just to pardon people based on race and only pardon white people, that would be a problem under the Equal Protection Clause. There's complications on how that would get in front of court, but that can't be right. So I wrote my first opinion editorial for the Baltimore Sun, and then I started writing more and more, and then radio started listening to my writing, and they started asking me to talk about my writing, and then CBS heard me on the radio, and I did my first TV interview with CBS, then CNN heard me on CBS, and then MSNBC heard me on CNN, and 8 years later, I've done hundreds and hundreds of interviews and written 4 books on civic education. The first one being How to Read the Constitution and Why. Then I wrote one called What You Need to Know About Voting and Why, because even after all these years of teaching constitutional law and related classes, it dawned on me that everything actually does turn on the ballot box. The fulcrum of everything under the Constitution is really the vote. And then the third book is How to Think Like a Lawyer and Why, which really is a self-help guide. How do you make hard decisions and have difficult conversations? And you think about lawyers and wow, they make things more difficult and they argue all the time and they're conflict ridden, but actually not. Lawyers have to imagine the best possible case for their opponent. You have to assume you have a formidable adversary and understand thoroughly the other side's point of view, and understand also you might not get everything you want, and you have to tell your client to accept some kind of compromise. These foundational values that we've lost in public discourse and frankly in some of our personal relationships and our families. So that was the third book. And then the fourth book, actually, this publishing company asked me to write it, having looked at the other one, the other few books, and that's on the pardon power. And lo and behold, I think the pardon power, as of Sunday, with Joe Biden pardoning his son, Hunter Biden, is getting more attention, the actual power of the pardon, than it's ever gotten, in my experience. So it's a very timely time to have this conversation. I've been fielding dozens and dozens of calls from all over the world this week, wanting to talk about the pardon power because of Joe Biden's pardon. So let me just tell you a little bit about what it is. So the pardon power is in Article 2 of the Constitution, and for those of you who might not know, there are basically 3 big chapters of the Constitution, Articles 1, 2, and 3, and I call them the job descriptions for government. Article 1 is the job description for Congress. Article 2 is the job description for the president. Article 3 is the job description for the federal courts. And the big difference between our government and a monarchy, which is what the revolutionaries fought against, can be thought of as a pyramid. So under a monarchy, an unlimited monarchy, it's a triangle or a pyramid, and the power of government comes from God, the divine right of kings. And if you slayed the king on the battlefield, you become the boss, and the idea is God picked you. And so the king had unlimited authority, unlimited power, and they could pick winners and losers based on largesse of the king or a whim of the king. And there really wasn't much you could do about it as a citizen. And then in in 1215, the nobility in England got a little annoyed with the king having all the power, and they went to him and said, listen, we're not going to continue to give you a bunch of money and taxes so you could raise all these armies and have wars and stuff unless you agree to some rules. And the king agreed to some rules in exchange for the nobility to continue to follow the orders of the king. And that set of rules is called the Magna Carta. And it includes things like the idea of due process, that you can't be thrown into jail or executed without some kind of hearing. What is a hearing? It's a trial. So we have a due process clause. We have two of them now in our Constitution. The Fifth Amendment goes to the federal government. The 14th Amendment goes to the states. But it traces all the way back to common law England. The pardon power is similar, except actually the pardon power goes even further back. It goes to the New Testament. If anyone knows a little bit about the New Testament, ever heard of a guy by the name of Jesus of Nazareth? In Roman tradition, Jewish tradition, on the Sabbath, the people could decide on a pardon. And the Pontius Pilate, the leader, I think he was a governor or something like that. Anyway, he was in charge. He gave two options: a murderer by the name of Barabbas, Jesus Christ, and the people chose to pardon Barabbas. Jesus Christ was executed, and that gave birth to the Christian religion. And so the pardon is at this, these like really foundational concepts of Western culture, Eastern culture, religion, so many things. And it's really rooted in an idea of mercy. And it made its way into common law England. And around, I think, the 9th century, 10th century, and because at that time, there wasn't a criminal justice system in England. There weren't jury trials until the 13th century. There was certainly no 4th, 5th, 6th Amendment. There was no right against self-incrimination, no ban on unreasonable searches and seizures. There were no appeals. Most justice was between warring private factions. It was like the Hatfields and the McCoys. And so people, if you killed my brother, I could kill your brother. And eventually the king came in and said, no, actually a crime against one of my subjects is a crime against me. I can pardon people. And then the theory was to stop that cycle of violence. The framers basically adopted the pardon power with very little restraints. There was some discussion about whether there should be a ban on pardons for treason or whether the Senate should be able to sign off on pardons. And at the time of the ratification of the Constitution, King George III, if you have anyone who's seen the musical Hamilton, you know what that guy is. He had some restraints on his pardon power. So we in the United States right now, and the way we conceive of the president's pardon power is more powerful than the King of England that the revolutionaries fought to get rid of. And so I argue in the book, the mythology around the pardon power has been wrong for a long time. We don't have a king, no more kings. And increasingly, certainly after the Supreme Court's immunity decision this summer, manufacturing immunity for presidents if they commit crimes, the pardon power is like a king-like power. It is. There's no restraints on it at all. I think it's wrong for reasons I talk about in the book, but this is where we are. So how has the pardon power been used? The very first pardon was by George Washington for people who participated in the Whiskey Rebellion. That was what people call an amnesty pardon, a mass pardon. Presidents can pardon people to kind of move the country through a trauma. Jimmy Carter pardoned folks who dodged the Vietnam War draft. He arguably lost the re-election for that. The lore is that Richard Nixon was pardoned by Gerald Ford to move the country and heal the country. But my book is the forward. Some of you might be old enough to remember a guy by the name of John Dean, who was White House counsel under Richard Nixon and famously told the United States Congress there's a cancer on the White House, and actually was criminally convicted for his role in Watergate. He wrote the foreword to my book, Pardon Power, and talks about the pardon of Jimmy Hoffa that he actually drafted that pardon. He talks about that, quite interesting. And he said, actually Ford was not interested in moving the country forward. He didn't want to deal with a criminal trial of his predecessor. He just wanted to be able to do the work of his office and not have to deal with the hassle of that, which is quite interesting. So fast forward to the 20th century, I think some of the corrupt modern pardons started with George H.W. Bush, who pardoned people who were engaged in the Iran-Contra scandal, including Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger. And why is that arguably corrupt? Because the independent counsel was going to start looking into George Bush. So if you pardon folks, there's no leverage. The prosecution, the government doesn't have any leverage over them to make them talk anymore. They don't have to worry about being prosecuted. So it kind of clammed everybody up. Clinton had some pushback with his pardons. He pardoned his brother Roger. He pardoned a guy by the name of Mark Rich, who was a wealthy tax evader who fled to Switzerland and then gave money to Clinton interests. And so actually Congress investigated that pardon. The Department of Justice investigated that pardon to see if it was a pay-for-play pardon. No charges were brought, but it shows that at least back then, there was some sense that there was oversight of pardons. And Bill Clinton later wrote an op-ed saying he regretted that pardon because it tarnished his reputation. Then you fast forward to Donald Trump, who pardoned witnesses in the Mueller investigation, pardoned Roger Stone, pardoned Paul Manafort, pardoned Steve Bannon, pardoned Mike Flynn, pardoned people who, like George H.W. Bush, could have testified against him, dangled pardons on Twitter to try and encourage people to not talk to the government. He pardoned a bunch of hip hop artists. And I did a talk in Austin, Texas last month, and there was a high school teacher who raised his hand and said that, he has a lot of students of color who are their demographic is there's a lot of temptations to engage in crime, and that he has to explain to his students that Trump's pardon of the hip hop artist doesn't mean they'll get pardoned if they commit crimes, that these kids see that as a reason to commit crimes because they think they can just be pardoned like Kodak Black was pardoned. So interesting anecdote on how pardons do trickle down to behavior. I mean, law is all about incentives and disincentives. If you think you'll get away with it, people will do stuff. Donald Trump also pardoned Jared Kushner's dad, Charles Kushner, whom Chris Christie was U.S. Attorney in New Jersey at the time when he was prosecuted for tax evasion, federal election violations, and witness tampering. His brother-in-law was cooperating with the feds, and he found out about it. And so he hired a prostitute and then had the encounter with his brother-in-law and the prostitute that, he basically entrapped him, not to say that's an okay thing to do, but and videotaped him and sent the videotape to his own sister of her husband in an encounter with a prostitute that Charles Kushner had set him up in retaliation for his brother-in-law talking to the federal government about his crimes, about Charles Kushner's crimes. Charles Kushner has been tapped by Donald Trump to be ambassador of France in the next administration. So lots of very disturbing pardons the last round, very little press coverage, very little eyebrow raising. And then on Sunday, of course, Joe Biden pardoned his son, Hunter Biden. And people are, it's settling down, but the last 48 hours, people across the political spectrum, Democrats, media, everyone, for the most part, is very upset with Joe Biden. This is a violation of the rule of law. This undermines norms. How could he do this? This is corrupt nepotism. Newsflash, it's completely 100% constitutional. There's no due process for pardons. There's no equal protection for pardons. You can't say it's unfair. I got a pardon, didn't get a pardon. You can't second guess what the president does with pardons. The Supreme Court this summer in the immunity case said pardons are core power, that you can commit crimes with pardons. So selling pardons to the highest bidder in the next administration, according to our Supreme Court majority, is perfectly constitutional and above the law. That could not be, Donald Trump could not be prosecuted if he sells pardons. So it's a little weird that people are so mad at Joe Biden when he's not going to be president anymore. This was not really a corrupt pardon. I've argued in Politico and the Bulwark on CNN. I've done all kinds of interviews. I'll tell you what my view is on it. I think Joe Biden realizes that Donald Trump's going to politicize and weaponize the Justice Department because he's promised to do that. And he's appointing people that have promised to do that. What does that mean? To go using the massive power of the Justice Department, law enforcement, FBI, investigative powers to get revenge on political rivals, media, people he doesn't like. Kash Patel, his nominee for the FBI director, literally has an enemies list that's written in one of his books. You can look at it. I have friends that are on the enemies list, and Hunter Biden was on the enemies list. So you probably know Joe Biden, been in government a long time. Early days of his Senate career, his wife and family got in a car accident. His wife and little girl were killed. The two boys were in hospital. He remarried Jill. They had one other child, but the two boys went on. Bo, his son, went on to fight a war, the war in Iraq, and was exposed to burn pits, developed brain cancer, died of brain cancer in 2015. Hunter had a heroin addiction. He relapsed into heroin addiction after his brother died, and he made some mistakes. One of which, he went to buy a gun and lied on his gun application about his addiction and owned the gun for 11 days, having lied on his application. He was convicted by a jury last summer on that count by Joe Biden's Justice Department. He also didn't pay a bunch of his taxes and lied on his tax returns in the same period that he was having that addiction problem. He paid all his taxes back with interest, and he pled guilty in California to those crimes. Joe Biden not only pardoned those crimes, but issued a broad pardon for any crimes that could have been committed within a 10-year period. I believe he did that to immunize his son from Donald Trump's Justice Department using him, as a punching bag as political retribution against his father. And so I've argued that's a merciful pardon. It's not a pardon that has anything to do with Joe Biden entrenching his power or avoiding liability or corruption. I don't think Hunter Biden's going to run around committing more crimes. One of Donald Trump's people he pardoned went on to be arrested and charged with domestic violence over the summer. I mean, that's the kind of person probably shouldn't be pardoned. He had a very hefty record of a violent background. And not to pick on Donald Trump, there have been other people that have pardoned folks that have gone on to commit crimes, but Hunter Biden's not really the issue. I think the issue in this moment is what Donald Trump's going to do to the Justice Department. And Joe Biden, I think, basically named the elephant in the room that people don't want to believe. And I think it's a testament in part to Joe Biden that people held him to a higher standard, and they're very disappointed that he's not adhering to the old norms in this moment out of fidelity to protect his remaining living son. Now, Joe Biden did issue a statement explaining the pardon that attacked his own Justice Department as partisan and political. Not a good idea. He could have called off that investigation. It was within his power. It would have been politically damaging to him, but he did not. So it's tough for him to get mad at his own employees, and it's giving, not only Donald Trump, but Eric Adams, the mayor in New York that's been indicted. Now everyone's running around saying, well, Joe Biden admitted that prosecutors are corrupt. So now we've got a new talking point that prosecutors are corrupt coming out of the President of the United States, Joe Biden's mouth through his paper. That's really not a good thing. So that is a legacy that was unnecessary, and I think a valid critique of that pardon. But the broader critique of Joe Biden's pardon is a critique of the pardon power itself and the unlimited power of the pardon, which wipes out the other branches of government. It wipes out all the work of the judicial branch. It wipes out the work of the juries. It wipes out all the appeals. It wipes out the law. It wipes out the criminal laws under which that person was convicted. It is a king-like power. The Supreme Court has said it's not checked. I think that's wrong, but for now we're beholden to this Supreme Court majority. And I argue in the book that it should be amended. We should have a constitutional amendment to get rid of this relic. That is, I think we're going to see abuses in the next administration that we've never seen before. So lots to unpack there. I know Deborah said she would. Man, I know there's a lot of stuff happening in the chat, and I with the time, I spoke for about 25 minutes. I can be here till about 1:50, and happy to take questions about any of it, all of it, or whatever else you want to talk about. I talk about all this kind of stuff a lot. So.
Okay, I will take questions from the chat, but if someone wants to speak directly, they can raise their hand and unmute themselves and ask questions as well. Just can you give just the book was very informative, and can you just sort of backpedal a little and just talk a little bit about the 3 types of pardons, and can there be conditions, and just a little bit of an overview kind of about what a pardon is and how it presents in that.
So traditional pardon is forgiveness by the president for the crime. It doesn't wipe out the criminal record. It doesn't make you have a clean record that it doesn't exist. You still had that criminal conviction, but the fallout from that is erased. You're basically forgiven for it. To get a completely clean record, that's a different process called an exoneration. It has to happen from a judge. The other kind of pardon is a commutation. So you still have that criminal record, and you're not forgiven for it, but you can have your sentence shortened. So you could go from life, death penalty to life in prison, or, and Donald Trump did this a fair amount. You could have your time served. So you have a 25-year prison sentence, you get out at 5 years. The third kind of pardon would be the amnesty pardon that I mentioned, these mass pardons for lots of people, and there are pardons across the globe except for China. Some countries do it some countries did amnesty pardons because of COVID, knowing that people incarcerated were going to die at disproportionate numbers by that, and they thought that there needed to be mercy, so people didn't get a death sentence by virtue of having been incarcerated. Presidents, I argue in the book too, we talk about the corrupt pardons, but presidents could use it for good. So Joe Biden could say between now and January 20th, listen, I'm going to pardon people on death row that have evidence that they're innocent. There isn't any good mechanism in the federal system to get out of prison or even to have your death sentence removed. There's no parole in the federal prison system since the 1980s. It doesn't exist. And under the habeas corpus law and Supreme Court law, even if you've got an eyewitness or DNA evidence, it's very hard to get out of prison. It's very hard to get your sentence commuted to life in prison, even if you're innocent. If you have a death penalty conviction. And the irony is, in a case called Herrera versus Collins, the Supreme Court said, we're not going to help people get out of prison, even if they have or have their death penalty suspended, even if they now have evidence that they're innocent, because they can always be pardoned. So the pardon power is used as an excuse to not fix the other problems in the criminal justice system. Oh, you can always get a pardon, like those kids, those teenagers in Austin. So we are literally, as a government, our taxpayer dollars are going to executing innocent people because the Supreme Court said the president can always pardon them. Meanwhile, presidents since Reagan, with the exception, I think, of Biden and Obama, have consistently run their political campaigns on a tough on crime platform. Americans love tough on crime. We spend $80 billion with a B in taxpayer money every year on our incarceration system and our criminal justice system. And there's no discussion among politicians to make sure that is being used efficiently. We know for sure, the Supreme Court knows, we are imprisoning, we are taking people's liberty and taking their lives when they are innocent. And voters are just handing over their tax dollars, their paychecks to do that on the theory that there's always a pardon. And it's not being robustly used in that way. In 2013, Obama did commute about 1,300 drug sentences because the law had changed. And if those folks had been prosecuted in 2013, they would have gotten shorter sentences. He thought that was unfair, so they should get the new sentence. And of course, Joe Biden pardoned a lot of marijuana offenses. So did Wes Moore, the Maryland governor. Of course, governors and boards across the country, they're not all governors who have the kind of power presidents do. But at the state level, there's a pardon system as well. And there are many more crimes at the state level than there are federal crimes, but a lot of the attention goes, I think, on presidential pardons because of the possibility of severe corruption within the federal government.
Can you talk a little bit about, those people those students that you mentioned, they think they're going to get pardoned, but actually it's quite hard to get attention to be pardoned. I mean, it ends up that, only the privileged few kind of get pardoned. Can you talk a little bit about that process and how you need to draw attention to yourself to even be in the ballpark of that?
Right. So again, this is at the federal level. So it's different for the state by state is different, but basically there's the application on the DOJ website. The people that review pardon applications, I think there's 10 to 12,000 of them per every 4 years. So every president has, and they might pardon a few hundred. You have to fill out an application. The application requires considers as part of the criteria that you have remorse for your crime. So even under the pardon application, exonerating evidence is not a basis for a pardon under DOJ guidelines. The DOJ lawyers, it's called the Office of the Pardon Attorney, they're DOJ lawyers. They then make recommendations to the president. Now, keep in mind that DOJ is the same group of folks that put these folks in jail. So it's a bit of a conflict of interest. There are different lawyers. It's not the same lawyers, but you have DOJ prosecutors deciding whether to undo the work of DOJ prosecutors. So that alone is a bit of a strike against anyone wanting to be pardoned. And under DOJ guidelines for a pardon, you have to have completed your sentence, and there needs to be 5 years after you're done with your sentence to be eligible for a pardon. Now, that's the way Joe Schmendrick does it. That you file your application, you're one of thousands, and those might be the most eligible people. There's a woman by the name of Alice Marie Johnson who is a mother, single mom, got caught up in a drug ring with her boyfriend. Other folks pleaded and cooperated with the government. She wasn't given that opportunity. They threw the book at her. She was put in prison for years, away from her family. Barack Obama, they went through the system. He denied the pardon. I mean, the president doesn't have time to look at all these. Kim Kardashian found out about her story and pressured her buddy Jared Kushner, and Alice Marie Johnson got a pardon from Donald Trump, and then was pulled out on the campaign trail as this, story. But Rudy Giuliani reportedly was selling pardons for $2 million a pop. There are, Alan Dershowitz, Harvard professor who defended Donald Trump in the first impeachment. He also defended O.J. Simpson. He was taking money to lobby for pardons to the president. Donald Trump bypassed DOJ in record numbers, and you don't have to, it's optional whether to even consider DOJ. So as Deborah indicates, just like in the criminal justice system, if you have money, you can get really good lawyers to defend you. And if you're going to go to trial and you have a lot of money, you can even, a really good lawyer will assemble a team of fake prosecutors, a fake judge, and a fake jury, and do a simulated trial and appeal so you can work out the kinks. If you're poor and you can't make bail, you serve your sentence before the government has even put a single piece of evidence against you. The idea of innocent until proven guilty only applies if you have money for lawyers and bail. It does not apply to poor people. The Constitution does not recognize poverty as something it should care about, and the Supreme Court never has. So pardons are the same as the rest of our system. Civil justice too. If you have good lawyers, you can get a fair divorce. You can defend yourself against a slip and fall lawsuit that didn't exist. Pardons are the same way, which I argue in the book. I think they're anachronistic, and we shouldn't really have them anymore if they're not really working to help the people that need the mercy, that need the break. It's not operating that way, at least not in numbers in my mind that justifies the countervailing corruption that pardons are increasingly inviting at the top of the executive branch of the federal government.
Thank you. Someone named Jordan has raised his hand.
Yeah, yeah. Two questions, if you could address either one. The J6 coming pardons, possibly, and the self-pardon, which blows my mind.
Yeah, so the J6 pardon, so Donald Trump has promised to pardon the January 6th insurrectionists. We'll see if he does that. There was a survey, one of the first surveys ever done on pardons this summer. Both Democrats and Republicans, majorities, did not want to see the January 6th insurrectionists pardoned because they're worried about a private militia for Donald Trump that would then feel green-lighted to engage in political violence around elections. I think a bigger issue, I had lunch with a person recently whose sister is married to one of the Capitol Police officers that were there on January 6th and has been outspoken about the trauma. And then the death threats against him and his family, his kids, they've had to go into hiding. He's very worried about his family if the January 6th people are pardoned. I know people that work on the Hill. They're worried that those folks are going to show up in Democrats' offices, start bullying staffers. So in my mind, that's a problematic pardon. Could Donald Trump do it? 100%. There's no limits really on pardons. There are a few that I talk about in the book, but nothing meaningful. On the self-pardon, I think it's anachronistic. It's now that the Supreme Court has given presidents immunity for crimes committed using official power, manufacture that out of thin air. It actually violates parts of the Constitution. There's no need for a self-pardon because they're immunized. There's nothing to pardon because you can't be prosecuted anyway. Jack Smith has dismissed the other cases, so he can't pardon the state cases, but there will never be a question of self-pardon anymore now that the Supreme Court's amended Article 2 to give presidents constitutional immunity for crimes committed using official power. I know there's a direct message in the chat. I don't think it went to Deborah, and I know, so this is Steve Schmall. He has to leave, so I want to take this question. You said you advocate amending the Constitution to place some limits on the power to pardon. What would your preferred amendment do to the pardon power? Great question. So, I haven't thought about that in granular detail, but I can say a few things. I would ban pardons in the last 3 months of office, or I would ban pardons prior to a presidential election. If you had to get all your pardons out on the table by November 3rd of an election year, then the corrupt pardons are not going to be as attractive because the voters could give you backlash on voting day. That is a limit that exists in other parts of the world. I would also probably have a pardon commission, which a lot of states have, and this is something Congress could do, where you have a cross section of folks people in the criminal justice system, prison officials, maybe psychologists, maybe a former inmate, that can really assess the objectives of the pardon, that's mercy objective, and have a public record of that. That could be done without a constitutional amendment. I would absolutely amend the Constitution. There is a proposal this summer to amend the Constitution to put the pardon power back, or put the immunity, get rid of the immunity. I mean, I think there needs to be amendments to pull back on the Supreme Court. But actually, the Congress could narrow the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. So Congress can fix the Supreme Court now. That's another conversation. But I would absolutely amend it to, this is what I would do. I would amend the Constitution to put affirmative right to vote in the Constitution. This is getting a little bit off topic, because there is no actual citizens have a right to vote in the Constitution. It is not there. And that is why there's so many shenanigans around ballot box access, and why the Supreme Court sides with donors and corporations, because it's not in the Constitution. So we should add that. There are amendments that say you can't keep certain people from the polls. You can't keep people of color from the polls. You can't keep women from the polls. But there's nothing that says, by the way, you have an affirmative right, a constitutional right to vote. It's not in the Constitution. That needs to be added. The Constitution needs to be added to say corporations don't have First Amendment rights. They don't have Social Security numbers. They don't have birth certificates. They are not human beings with rights like us. That is flooded money into politics, which is why we're not really a democracy anymore. That's the second thing I would do. As far as the pardon power, I mean, get rid of the immunity ruling and make it clear there's no self-pardons, and require some kind of oversight of pardons. I think there should be an appeal of pardons. Maybe it's appeal to, both houses of Congress by a supermajority can override a pardon or something. There should be some mechanism, and I would also ban pardons in that lame duck period. Now, that doesn't address somebody that's not running for office a second time, but whoever they're anointed behind them to take their the next Democratic, the Kamala Harris, there'd be pressure on the sitting president not to mess things up for their successor. So I think either way, that would probably clean up a lot of the corrupt pardons. The other thing that Congress could do right now is amend the Lobbying Disclosure Act, which does actually apply to presidents, to make it clear that you can't ban lobbying for pardons. That's a violation of the First Amendment, but you could put constraints on lobbying for pardons, and that you gotta make a record. You gotta register as a pardon lobbyist. You gotta file reports of a pardon lobbyist. You gotta say who's giving you your money and to lobby the president. So the rest of us, the media, the public, know who's paying for these pardons. And then there might be, again, I said earlier, it all comes down to the ballot box. We could then put political pressure on the system to have fairer pardons.
No, it would be great if all those things could move forward, but it's hard to imagine it all happening. But
well, any of it, frankly, Deborah. I mean, that's another conversation. I mean, we are absolutely in for some very, very dark days, and we might not survive as a democracy the next 4 years.
Yeah, I was
it's true.
Just to end on, or to talk about a little bit, are there checks and balances with the upcoming administration? Like what positive things can we cling on to?
I think the answer to that is actually no. There are the courts. So there will be lawsuits that can be filed. We can't do anything about crimes committed by Donald Trump. But in terms of trying to fire a bunch of federal workers, there's all kinds of statutory protections in place and regulatory protections that will be clunky and difficult to do. Widespread repealing of regulations by executive order, that's going to be clunky and difficult to do. Can he use the Insurrection Act to bring the military against peaceful protesters? Yes. That probably is something it's a law that is pretty open and vague, but we do have state militias, we have state police forces, we have state governors. So I think the states are going to be important. I think what I tell people is, and this is just more my personal philosophical approach to life, which there are others that probably live longer than I have and are more cogent in this regard. Sometimes it's in the darkest moments that we actually pull together and find our strength. And I think Americans are way too complacent with the freedoms of our democracy. Of course, there's a lot of lies online, and the digital age has spread misinformation, disinformation, and lies like wildfire. But people are eating up the anger and the hatred and the othering and all of these things, and we really take it for granted. So, I think it's going to get a lot worse, but before it gets better. But I think the situation we were in was unsustainable. Kamala Harris was not going to save democracy. It was just kicking the can down the field. There's too many institutional problems. So I think there needs to be a major upheaval. It's almost like the forest fire before there's new growth. I don't know what that looks like. I don't have a plan. But maybe some new leadership and some willingness to really fight hard for democracy. I mean, my grandmother emigrated, in the early 20th century from Ukraine. So I'm a quarter Ukrainian, and I was in Norway in the spring doing a keynote at a major event on First Amendment and free speech. It wasn't just free speech. And the woman who gave the keynote the year before was a reporter in her 30s. She went back to Ukraine 3 weeks later and was killed by a bomb. And the people there, just a stone's throw from that effort to save their democracy, what those people were doing, the courage, the sacrifice, the energy was very different from what we have here. And I think if people understand what's at stake and they really see we have to pull together and politicians are not our friends, maybe on the other side we can have an actual fairer, more democratic, more equal environment. Equal is a difficult word, but it's going to take a lot of pain to get there, and it's going to be a scary few years.
I sometimes find it comforting to think that we've had a long history and there have been a lot of ups and downs and a lot of cycles. And in the book, you talk about different things related to pardon power, over the years, and there have been, some difficult things that our country has, gotten through. So maybe that's also a way to look at it. This might be, part of the cycle.
Yeah, I mean, we got through a revolution in 1776. We got through a civil war. I think that's, saying kind of the similar thing. Maybe Americans will pull together. I mean, I know you're not saying this, but some people will say, oh, don't worry about it. The sky is not falling. I mean, eventually the sky can fall. I mean, we got through that by the skin of our teeth, by the grace of God or whatever. Doesn't mean we'll get through this one. But it does mean that there's a history of getting through some hard things. If people pull together with their better angels and they're in a connection and a oneness as humans, as people, and not as partisans.
Okay. Well, I know you have to move on to your next thing, and you're in high demand these days because it's such a topical issue. So I want to thank you for spending time with us and joining Chevy Chase at Home for our speaker series. And I want to invite everyone to explore our other programming listed on our website. And, I thank everyone for joining us and have a great rest of the day.
Thanks so much. Have a great day, everybody.